Hello, everyone. I'm Ralph, a software engineer here at Genesys, and in this DevDrop, I'll show you how to create data actions in Genesys Cloud and CX's code. To start, what are data actions? They are an integration tool that create custom actions within your flow. The action can involve calling the Genesys Platform API or other external resources like AWS, Zendesk, Salesforce, or any other API service to retrieve or process data. This tool gives great flexibility and functionality in your flows that can improve customer experience and make business processes more efficient. We already have a video that talks in detail about data actions, and the link to it is in the video description. Regardless, I will still demonstrate in this DevDrop how to create one. So let's start by making one in the Genesys Cloud UI. Let's say I want to fetch a data from an API service that retrieves a random fact, which I can use to send to the customer while they're on hold or waiting. There's a free API that lets us do that, which is Useless Facts by Joseph Paul. So you can see in his website that there are two endpoints we can use. So the first one is get random fact, and the second one is get today's useless fact. And it has two options that we can configure. So the first one is language, where we can choose either English or Deutsch for the useless fact. And the second one is the content type, where we can edit the accept header to set the output as a JSON or a plain text. So this is a very simple API service that we can use to integrate it as a data action in the Genesys Cloud. So the first step to do that is to create an integration in the Genesys Cloud. So let's go to the Genesys Cloud and go to admin and go to integrations and let's make one. So with integrations, we have already provided some presets for common services and applications like AWS, Google, Jenkins, Microsoft, and many more, which is a jumping point for you to make the data actions easily. Usually, these custom integrations have preset the configurations that you'll need in order to access those services properly. So for example, with AWS, it might ask the AWS role ARN that can call the Lambda. Or with Genesys Cloud, where you will need an OAuth client details to call the platform API. You can also explore other integrations in the Genesys App Foundry. So for our case, we'll just use the standard web service. So this is the web services data action. So let's install one. And once we installed it, we just have to name the integration that we'll be making. So this one, let's name it as useless facts integration. And we have to configure some things if needed. So there are three things that we can configure. So the first one is properties. Unfortunately, with the web services, we cannot add properties, but we can adjust the client certificate that it'll be using. And then the next one is advanced, where it is a JSON object where you can add some properties and details. And last one is credentials, where you might need this if the API services that you'll be accessing requires credentials. So you can either add a basic auth, user-defined, or OAuth. So that's for the configuration. And then for the support, it just provides details about the integrations or some support links and more information at the resource center for the web services data actions. So that's it. And we just have to activate it since we'll be using it for our data actions. And while waiting, I hope this is just quick. So yeah, it's quick and let's just save it. And we can use this integration for our data action. And to do that, let's just go to actions and let's add the action. We'll use the integration that we just created. And for action, we'll be using the get random fact. So let's name it as get random fact. Let's add it. And once we've added the data action, it will be created as a draft since we'll be configuring some things. And the first one is contracts. So contracts are like the schema that defines the input and output when calling the action. So for our case, we just need to define the actual output of the endpoint we'll be calling. So I've just called the endpoint in Postman, and it outputs a JSON object with 6 properties. Oop, I just clicked it. So it has ID, text, source URL, language, and the permalink. So let's just define it here on the output contracts. And the first one is the object. So with the title, let's just name it as fact. Let's add the other properties, the ID, the text, the source, the source URL, the language, and the permalink. Yep, so that's it. And do take note, once this data action is published, we cannot modify the contracts anymore. So be sure to properly define it, both the input and the output contract. So once you have defined those, we can proceed to the configuration where we can define the endpoint that we'll be calling, starting with the request and the response. So first, for the request, you can define the method, and you can also define the request URL template, can add headers, can add a execution timeout for this. So with the other methods, for example, for post, we can also define the request body template. As you can see here, you can see a variable input that raw request, which is this one on the right side. You can see the available inputs and the available outputs, where you can see in the inputs, you can use it as a variable for the templates in the request, both in the URL template and also in the body template. So you can also use the properties inside to set it in the template. So for example, in our example here in the useless facts, where we can add a language here. So let's define here in the contracts, let's make the objects config, and the one property that it'll ask is language. So here in the configuration, you can see that it has added a language input, and we can actually add it here. Once you click it, sometimes it would copy, but sometimes when you put it here, it would automatically paste it here. So yeah, but for our demonstration, we won't be using it. So yeah, let's just remove this one. And I think that's okay for the request. Now for the response, there are 3 things that you can configure. So the first one is the translation map, where it uses the JSON path syntax, where you can map out the JSON response that you receive. And the second one is the translation map defaults, where you can set a default value on the one that you map on the translation map if there is an error mapping the response. So for example, you wanted to map out a list from the response that you receive. And once there is a problem, you can set an empty list for that. That's where you set it in the translation map defaults. And the last one is the success template, which allows you to map out the final output to the one you set in the contract. And you can use the translation map, the one that you use to put it in the success template. So it uses the variable notation from velocity template language. And you can know more about it in this article at the Genesys Cloud Resource Center, which I've put the link in the video description, where you can use some utils to map it out to form it as the final output to the one that you've defined in the contract. So for our demonstration, I've just put here the raw result, since the one that we got from the use as facts is the same to the one that we've defined in the output contract. So once you have configured the contracts and the configuration, we can test it internally first to see if it's working. So yeah, let's test it. So it's still saving. It's saving as a draft before it can be tested. And once it's being tested, since it's successful, it returns the output of the contract, also returns the JSON. And you can also see some of the details while it's been testing, from the validation of the request to performing the authentication, checking out the request template, the header template, and the body template. And you can also see the translation map that's been done, and then the output against the schema and things like that, which you can try and test before saving and publishing this data action. So once you've done configuring this one, we can save and publish this one for our flows to be used. So yeah, again, once you have saved and published this one for our flows, you cannot define the contracts or modify the contracts anymore. So yeah, that's how we do it in the Genesys Cloud UI. And now, how do we do it in CX's code when we want our Genesys Cloud resource to be managed properly? So as an overview, CX's code is our tool for managing Genesys resources via Terraform. We have also made a DevDrop about CX's code with a link in the video description. So configuring a data action in CX's code is very easy. So I've created a basic Terraform project already with the Genesys Cloud provider already set up. So I've set up the client ID and the client secret, and also the region I've defined it. So here in the main file of the Terraform, I have created the same integration and the same data action that we've just created. So let's try to break it down on how I created this in the documentation in the Terraform registry. So for the integration, it has the resource Genesys Cloud _ integration. And you can see here with the schema, it is almost the same with the one that we saw in Genesys Cloud UI, where you'll be required to define the integration type, also have to provide the name, also provide the configurations like advanced, credentials, notes, and properties. And in here, you can also set in Terraform the intended state if you want it to be active or inactive. So yeah, this is very similar to the one that we saw in the Genesys Cloud UI. And the next one is the data action, which is named as the Genesys Cloud _ integration _ action resource. And you can see here on the schema that it is also the same that we just saw in the Genesys Cloud UI, where we need to provide the contract input, the contract output as JSON. You can see it here that when we have created it in the Genesys Cloud UI, we can also see the JSON version of it, where we can copy and paste it if we want to transfer it to a CXS code project. Yeah, similar to the input contract. So when going back to the documentation, you can also see the integration ID, which we need to link the integration that we were going to be using for this data action and the name. And also we can set up the config request, the config response, and also the timeout. You can see here in the request, it's the same. You can provide the request type, the URL template, the headers, and also the request template. And as you can see here, there is a note where you can see on the variables, you can see that here in Genesys that there is only a single dollar. When we try to put it in the CXS code or in Terraform, we need to add an additional dollar. Since if we didn't do this, Terraform will recognize it as a variable in Terraform and not as a text. So do be careful on that. So when you try to copy and paste the one that you're using here in the Genesys Cloud UI, do make sure that to add another dollar sign in it. So yeah, this is almost the same to the one that we are going to configure in CXS code. So when we go back and see the same integration and same data action that we created last time, is you can see here for the integration, we have just put the intended state as enabled, the integration type as custom REST actions, and the name as useless facts integration test. And then for the data action with the get random fact, you can see that I have set the integration ID to the one we've created here. We've set the name. And then for the contract input, you can see it's a JSON. So I've used a JSON encode and copy pasted it to the one that we've created in the UI. So let's see it here. Yep, it's the same. Also for the output contract, which is also the same here. Then for the config request, it's the same. We use the URL template as this one, and the request type is get. And for the config response, I leave the translation map as an empty object, and also for the default. For the success template, I've put the raw result variable here. And you can see that I've added a dollar here to make sure that Terraform sees it as a string itself, not as a variable. So when we remove this one, it will see that it is a variable. So yeah, that's how you do it in CXS code. And in addition, we have also provided some presets or modules of integrations and data actions similar to what we have in Genesys Cloud UI. You can see these in our Genesys Cloud DevOps organization in GitHub. And it's here. And you can browse the repositories to see the modules created for integrations and data actions. So one example is the Genesys Platform API integration, where it helps you immediately set up the integration to use the Platform API by providing the client credentials. You can also get the preset by putting the GitHub repo URL in the source, which Terraform will then fetch it. So for example, here in the usage, you need to declare it as a module, and you can name it as such. And you have to provide a source, which you can just add git and then a double colon to the link of the module that you want to use. So this repository has provided it. And you have to provide the integration name, the client ID, and the client secret for this to work. So I've also made one in here. So it's here at the bottom. So yeah, so I've made a Genesys Cloud integration and I name it as Genesys Cloud Integration Test and provided the client ID and client secret. And to use it, for a data action to use it, I've created one. So it's called Get Active Users. And the contract input, I've requested it to give a page number. And for the contract output, I've defined that it gives out an array of division IDs, user emails, user IDs, and usernames, which is not the same with when calling the get active users endpoint. So you can see here in the config request, it's similar. And you can see here on this side that I requested to put the variable of page number from the contract input, which we can use it here. And for the config response, you can see that I've used the translation map to map out the div IDs, the emails, the IDs, the names. And you can see that it's in JSON path syntax. So the dollar dot entities and everything in it dot division dot ID. And you can see here in the translation map defaults that if there's a problem with the translation, it would just output an empty array for these things. And for the page count, it will just return a 0. And as you can see here in the template, it's just a string where it would get the variables of the one that you made in translation map. So for the user IDs, it would get the IDs, user emails, it would get the emails, usernames, it would get names, page count, the page count, and the division IDs would be the division IDs, which the success template is required to conform to the contract output that we've defined here. So once you have defined and made a Terraform project out of this, we can just deploy this one actually. So let's Terraform apply and let's just auto approve this one. And yeah, let's wait for it. Yep. It will create 5 resources, even though this is 4, because the module here creates 2 resources here in Genesys for the Genesys Cloud integration. But yeah, since everything is fine on the project that I've created, it will be deployed in our Genesys Cloud account, which we can see here on the actions. Let's filter this one out. Yep, here, it's here. The first one is the get random fact. And the other one, which is get active users here. So, yep. And you can also check out if it's working. Although since this data action is published, we cannot change this one. We might have the option to configure the request template, but we can still test it, which I'm confident that this will work. So yeah, it run and it mapped out the division IDs, the page count, and things like that. So yeah, that's how you create data actions both in Genesys Cloud and CXS code. So I hope this will help you streamline your organization's CI/CD development to improve customer experience. Please do visit the Genesys Cloud Developer Center for the latest blogs, blueprints, accelerators, guides, DevDrops, and other resources. I hope to see you again on my next DevDrop. Bye.